Um, Good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to this, the third of our Dante public lectures. And I'm delighted to welcome this evening Professor Andrea Aldo Robiglio. Andrea is a professor of history and of medieval and Renaissance philosophy at the Catholic University of Leuven. He obtained his MA and his PhD from the Catholic University Sacro Cuore in Milan. Before moving to Leuven. And he's also lectured and taught in many fine institutions, including Freiburg in Switzerland and Freiburg in Germany, the two, and also Notre Dame, Groningen, as well as other places as well. And this area of specialization concerns the history of philosophy with a focus on philosophical anthropology, ethics and politics, extending from the 12th to the 17th centuries. Another area of scholarly activity concerns the history of philosophical historiography, especially in the 20th century, and the relation between philosophy and literature. Now, he has many extensive publications, many publications on Dante in particular also, but I also want to recall here his volume L'impossibile volere Tommaso d'Aquino, I tomisti della volontà, that was published in 2002. He is also the senior editor of this quite wonderful journal, Mediterranea. Now, this is a very special journal, and I think it's worth mentioning here at the very beginning because it's an international journal focusing on various areas of knowledge transfer from late antiquity to the early modern period, covering the Middle East and the Mediterranean basin, and paying special attention to philological, philosophical, scientific, cultural, and religious fields of research. So it really is a very important journal of our times. He has a wonderful title, and one that's particularly interesting for me for this evening's lecture, and it starts with a question. If Dante returned to Jerusalem, would he find himself in Camelot, on the chivalric undertone in Dante's comedy? So please join me in welcoming Andrea. Okay.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Darek, for the invitation to Cork. It's my first time here, but also for the context of this invitation, because you have been able in the last year to create a true tradition of Dante lectures here in Cork that allow to maintain alive an interest that in Ireland and also well reflected in Anglo-Irish literature, the function Dante is of first importance. Decades ago in Dublin, there have been a tradition of those Dante lecture. It was discontinued there, but it continues here. And this, so congratulations because this takes a lot of energy, time, some disappointments. Occasionally, to fill the program, you have also to invite scholars who are not really a specialist of Dante like tonight, but you need them to fill the program. So my congratulations to you. And for here in the room, I'm particularly grateful the presence of Corina Salvadori Lonergan. By the way, a fructibus arbor cognoscitur, because this is also a direct line of teaching and mentorship. The title of my talk is indeed a bit elusive and puts together the reference to Jerusalem and to Camelot. The inspiration came from scholarship of the 80s. In particular, Marc Giroir published a very fine volume. Was it in the field of art history, but more generally cultural history, The Return to Camelot, Chivalry and the English Gentleman, was published in 81. And this book is important because it documents in a very brilliant way how this medievalism of until well into the Victorian age was a feature that characterized also the scholarship is coalescent to some extent with the scholarship on Dante not only the scholarship, but think of the easy reference to the pre-Raphaelite movement, of course, but also other figures, and this fascination and interest for the Middle Ages, but is a particular Middle Age. Is a Middle Ages in which Orientalism on the one side and the world of the knights and warfare and chivalric culture are mixed together. If you visit today Leuven House, which is a museum, it used to be the residence of one of famous painter, Lord Leuven, you can clearly see this mixture of Oriental decor and reference to the medieval and early Renaissance author. And again, as a note on the fairground, some articles, in particular, I mentioned Exempli Grazia, the article by John Larner, Chivalric Culture in the Age of Dante. It was published in '88. And the author, who was then professor at the University of Glasgow, writes what is still today true, and I quote as a sort of introduction. It would be untrue to say, writes Larner, that this is a neglected study, namely the chivalric culture in Dante. For many have considered at least some of its literary aspects. Yet, by comparison with those other leading influences of the age, scholasticism, civil and canon law, early humanism, and so on, it is something which is being under-evaluated. This is a judgment expressed in '88, and I have to say, can be written today on at the beginning of an article in an arguably responsible way. Why this topic, despite this sort of suggested connection, why this topic can bring some light? My way of presenting it is to show that helps us, for instance, to understand some terms that Dante uses. So I will focus really on a couple of terms, in particular on one, coltello, knife. And just focusing on these, and that has been overlooked by all translators, even the most gifted one, I would try to show, well, this has been overlooked and therefore mistranslated, not because those people didn't know Dante or didn't know Italian or Latin or English, but simply because they didn't take into account this culture of Dante, this Romance culture of Dante, which is like an undertone, which is in the background also of his uses of other cultures. So in the last decade, it's quite common in the literature on Dante to use the plural, to pluralize things. So we do not speak anymore of the culture of Dante, but cultures of Dante. This is certainly an improvement, but it risks to be just a makeup if these cultures are not seen in connection, especially because Dante, and generally speaking, the medieval mind, is not a parataptic mind, if you allow me the expression. It's not a mind in which a plurality can stand on the same level. This plurality expresses a design and therefore involves an order hierarchy. And therefore, there are these many cultures, undeniably, but there is an order among them. And if you put one below the other or above the other, this is not neutral. it changes the way in which a source is received. Dante clearly quotes Aristotle, fine. But it's different if Aristotle, the scholastic work of Aristotle, is quoted as a schoolman from a school text, as a reader of poetry via an Aristotle which is already filtrated in the literature, and so on. Or as a monk in a cloister who is doing theology, and as other mediation. And it's certainly true that when Dante writes, the age of the knights is now gone by. However, not the imagery, not the literature, which exactly in that period, well until the time of Cervantes, remain a fundamental reference. So to start with, I would like to start a bit from an external point, from an autobiographical memoir of Peter Brown, of Irish origin, the great scholar, a great specialist of ghosting. Peter Brown has been a pupil indirectly, though in a relevant way, of another great historian, Arnaldo Momigliano. And at a certain point, he had to write a sort of in memoriam of Momigliano, and he went back to study the context of Momigliano education, and he realized how important had been the role of Benedetto Croce, the great erudite and Italian Napolitan philosopher. And here is what he writes in his autobiographical memoir, Peter Brown. So while doing this research, I quote, "You can imagine my surprise when I read in a short memoir on Croce, written by a contemporary, that sometimes around 1900, the philosopher had challenged a colleague to a duel over an issue of metaphysical philosophy. This was the sort of information which makes one turn the page. I turned the page. No further information was provided. Plainly, the author of the memoir considered that, for his readers, the event was so normal, so much part of the academic life of Naples at the turn of the century, as to require no explanation. The sentence stood there, unashamed, unglossed. It was like coming up in an entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. This year were dragon scenes in the sky. Full stop. Well, this sort of note aside of Peter Brown makes me think and helps us to draw attention to aspects that for us may be out of our horizon, but they were well in the horizon of the author. And so, having this in mind, I will turn to a passage of the first book of the Convivio, the banquet, which is quite interesting, as I used to say to my students when in a course of medieval thought, I teach Dante, I'm not professor in any faculty of literature. I say, if Dante had not written the comedy, he would have a place among the great thinkers of the medieval thought. He wrote a fundamental work of political philosophy, an astonishingly original treatise, although incompleted, on language, which has no parallel in his own time. And this Convivio, this Prosimetron, unfortunately, he wrote the comedy, and his stature as philosopher became put in the corner as if that he was certainly a poet, but a poet who is a philosopher. Well, the Convivio, at the very beginning, he makes a reference to the knife. He says that he will, of course, the Convivio is the banquet. He has a table, he speaks of the bread of knowledge, this bread that is shared, bread of the angels, he said. So the image of the knife is obvious when you are speaking of a banquet where you are eating. And he says, now with lo coltello del mio giudicio purga questa forma. With the knife of my judgment, I'm using a Ryan translation of the Convivio, I am able to purify the commentary, both of what is improper and of what is unreasonable. The knife of my judgment is clearly a metaphor. But we will see that this word, the knife, that is repeated several times in the banquet, is probably to be understood in a different term. I do not want to make any spoiler here, but I would propose that this is a technical word for the sword of the knight. So it's not the knife. Of course, there is a word play with the vocabulary of the table and the knife used on the table to cut the bread. But the knife of the judgment is the sword of my judgment. And let's see where this suggestion brings and give more order to our presentation. Well, there is a passage in the Convivio that, to my knowledge, the commentator used to interpret in a standard way. Namely, this is an instance where we can see how untemperate Dante was. He was a person easy to react in a furious or violent way, was not always able of self-control. And what is this passage? Let me first read it in the original Italian and then give the translation. He speaks of an adversary, someone, qualcuno, l'avversario. We will see that this unnamed character is quite important. Volesse dicere che nelle altre cose nobiltà si intende per la bontà della cosa, ma negli uomini si intende perché di sua bassa condizione non è memoria. Rispondere si vorrebbe non con le parole, ma col coltello. My adversary might maintain that in other things, nobility is constituted by the excellence of the thing, but that in man, it is constituted by the lack of any memory of a man's base condition. To an opinion so grossly stupid as on that maintains that nobility in other beings signify excellence, and yet in man signifies forgetfulness of a man's base condition, the reply should be given not verbally, but with a knife. And here we have some commentator who even makes reference to the culture of vendetta, which indeed was a feature of the Italian communism. But I will try to show that here there is not at all vendetta play, vengeance play. It's a more ritualized and clear case of dueling. Well, this discussion has to do with the topic of the fourth treatise of the banquet, which deals with what is the true nobility. And there are some who claim that nobility is just to have a long line of ancestors, so long that it's impossible to establish the beginning. So this forgetfulness of the beginning would be this is one of the explanation. And for Dante, this is a longer discuss with argument. And at the end, he says, well, if you say that, you are contradicting yourself. Because on the one side, you claim that nobility is not something produced by time, is something atemporal, that have no memory of any origin of it. But on the other, you are explaining this no memory as simply a lack due to the length of time. So this is clearly a contradictory explanation. However, his adversary, even after this explanation by Dante, says, keep on saying, no, I maintain that. I said, well, if this person maintains that, and he admits that nobility usually is the intrinsic value, worth of something, but in the case of man, is simply this time first progressing and then being obliterated by oblivion, this man, you should engage with him in a duel. And when do you engage in a duel? Well, Dante himself already discussed in the Monarchy the problem of duel, and in that case in a very clear context. However, before moving to that part, let me put here an aside, because among the commentators of Dante, one of the most learned is certainly the above mentioned Benedetto Croce. Benedetto Croce, who in 1900, indeed, I went to look for the local newspaper of Naples who reported this episode. Peter Brown is wrong, it was not an issue of metaphysical philosophy, it was an issue of personal honor. Someone had said that in one of his historical essays, he had said something wrong. And he couldn't prove because the sources was not at the disposal of any of the two, so it was just his word against the other word. So he said, well, let's have a duel. He even trained for the duel, and he's a professor, he's a master of sword who trained Croce. He said, this man, so elegant and swift in the movement of his mind, and so slow and terrible in the movement of the body. Eventually, there was no duel because the common friends put an end to this, but still the ritual was there. Okay, Croce, commenting this passage, he says, nel convivio particolarmente emerge l'amore del filosofare, il godere dell'argomentare, le inventive ripianti, gli entusiasmi per la virtù, i movimenti feroci, come quello che è rimasto celebre del rispondere col coltello. He makes the reference to the passage I read before, and he says that this is a movimento feroce, is a ferocious reaction, is a ferocious move. So Croce himself doesn't see there any reference to dueling, but just to a reaction, a violent reaction, someone who is tired of discussing verbally with someone who persists in his lack of understanding of the argument itself. He just aggress him with a knife. But as I said, Dante himself speaks of duel. Let's speak of duel in the Monarchia in a context which is also in continuity with what he says in the Convivio. A little premise, sorry for those of you who know this already. The young Dante, before starting to write the Convivio, or at the very beginning of it only, thought that the power of Rome and the empire of Rome was acquired thanks to the army, and therefore thanks to the prevailing of the force against other peoples and countries. However, as a follower of Aristotle, he knows that in natural reality, in natural being, any violent movement cannot last forever. A violent movement is a movement that goes against his natural inclination. A stone, for instance, naturally falls down. You can throw a stone up in the air, but after a while, it will come down because it's an unnatural, it's a violent movement. Well, if the empire of Rome had been established by the use of force, this would be a violent movement, and therefore it wouldn't last. But for Dante, it's a bit a problem to admit that the empire, the very idea of empire, is fated to disappear. The empire is something natural that represents the best possible way. It's a sort of global empire, the possible way of living in peace and pursuing knowledge. This is the topic of the monarchy. And therefore, he understands, and he writes this already in the Convivio, and then he will repeat clearly, explicitly in the Monarchia. He understands that it was not by the use of force, but was by legitimate dueling. If I prevail in a duel, I'm not doing something in nature, but I establish a right that could last forever. And therefore, the Empire of Rome, this he says in the second book of the Monarchia, chapter 9, he explained that. And when he explained that, he also gave interesting definition of what a duel must be to be a legitimate way of establishing a right and not just an act of violence. It should respect some formal criteria. First of those formal criteria is to be a sort of last ultima ratio, to be a sort of last recourse. One has to first to try all other means of agreement and management of conflict, and only when no other solution is possible, then one can go to the combat. The second, the purpose of duel shouldn't be prevailing in order to obtaining something from the other person, getting land of property, of just making a revenge of some offense. This is not the other condition that should be respected is the intention. The intention on both sides should be propter zelum justitiae, for the sake of justice. This is the second. If these two formal requirements are present, then it's possible to have a combat in which the result establish a right. It's a sort of ordalic combat. And Dante goes so far to quote the Gospel of Matthew 18:20. You may remember this is the ipsissima verba Christi. Jesus says, when two will be united in my name, I will be with them. And here he applied that to the duel. When two are united in my name, here is the name of truth, propter zelum justitiae. Not because one doesn't like the other, or no, it should be really a way in which both of them, with all sincerity, think that they are in their own right, and well, then the final judgment of the duel is more than a human judgment, is a sort of divine judgment. And how this goes back to our text on the knife? Well, we know that the duel has an important role in the medieval chivalric culture. It is not would be useless here to mention instances in which this is. Should I close? Okay. But here come the picture that you see here from a famous text, the Rochester Bestiary. Is a text, is a manuscript prepared around the 1230s. Is now at the British Library, manuscript 12F13. And here we have a duel. And here we have another, this image is curious because at first blush, I don't know what you see, but many may see two horses hugging each other. Indeed, they are not hugging, they are just imitating what their master are doing. So it's a double duel. It's the duel of the knights and the duels of the horses. However, in this first impression, there is a deep truth. The duel implies the recognition of the adversary, implies the respect of certain limits of time, cannot last longer than one day, limits of arms used, limits even of space, should be in a given space with the presence of testimonies. And therefore, in a way, the duel displays incidentally, and with there is certainly violence and blood, and the possibility of death for sure, but in a very ritualized and even controlled use of violence. Therefore, there is a kind, it's too much to use the word friendship, but again, if you go to the Curtin literature, you see how many cases of friendly attitude are displayed by enemies, even from different religions during a duel. So the duel is a last recourse, but implies a recognition of the adversary. Now, the point is that in the passage we have read, it seems that Dante has in front of himself just someone who is stupid, who doesn't understand, and you can only convince by killing me. Indeed, and now is the last part of my talk, I will try to show that this recognition remains in the text and is shown by other elements. The first element I would like to draw your attention is this use of, in Italian, e dirà qualcuno, e l'avversario dirà. There is always, the whole structure of the argumentation is structured in a way in which there is a dialogue between the author, Dante himself, and an invisible opponent, which sometimes is more reasonable, sometimes it becomes really sort of pertinax, sort of really harder to convince. This in medieval rhetoric, and is attested already in the Rhetorica de Regnum, is the typical case of the fictio personae. The definition that you find in the Rhetorica de Regnum is cum aliqua que non ades persona configitur quasi absent. So when there is nobody, you could, for the sake of the argument, for fictionally purpose, to create the figure of a person with whom you engage in this argument. So first of all, we have to see this adversary as someone who appears in several of the philosophical treatises of Dante and represent, I wouldn't claim that he's one person there, but as a fiction is a sort of standard trope. And it is very interesting then another passage where he starts with this reference to someone who argued that, whom I replied that, etc. We find in the De Vulgari Eloquentia, we know, because it is an intertextual explicit reference, then the De Vulgari Eloquentia in complete treatise and the fourth book of the Convivio are written one after the other in the same period of Dante's life. There, book 1, chapter 2, paragraph 7 is I'm using Botterill translation. We read, if anyone, here is when the anyone is the alcuno, the opponent, this fiction. If anyone finds a contrary argument in what Ovid in the 5th book of the Metamorphoses says, talking of magpies, I reply that is said in a figurative way, and it means something else. And if it be claimed that to these days magpies and other birds indeed speak, I say this is not so. Well, the text is even more explicit, because in the text of Dante in the Latin, it says et hoc est falsum. So it's very explicit. This is false. Why this text is interesting? Here the objector, who is also someone who says something false, and therefore you shouldn't pay attention. Here the problem is only human being use language, because you have to be reasonable to use reason. Someone claimed that there are some animal who speak, but this is not to be taken literally, even though some author like Ovid say that. Well, here is someone who maybe doesn't know any Latin. It's not necessary to know Latin to have this information, because we have plenty of moralized Ovid in the libraries of the knights. Knights who are not always a keen reader, but those moralized versions, they have also these very nice illuminers. And so even someone who is not really a library rat, a knight, can easily have this information. So we know that this adversary is not just some uncultivated, stupid person who deserves no attention. Such a person, Dante, wouldn't be bothered if someone totally stupid. No, this is someone who belongs to an high rank of society. He is arguably an aristocrat, a knight maybe, who share in the same courtly literature that Dante knows also very well, and who engage with Dante on arguments that concern topic which Dante considered crucial. So let's move now from the De Vulgari back to our oppositor, to our adversary in the Convivio. We have, of course, there is a frustration in Aquinas because this adversary is unable to follow his logic. But this is not a lack of recognition of the status of the other person. And precisely because this recognition is there, it's possible to engage in a duel. A knight like Dante think of himself. Let's go for a moment back to the Divine Comedy. Everybody knows that the longest conversation, the longest speech in the entire comedy is found at the middle, over several cantos, at the middle of the Paradise, when Dante encounters Cacciaguida. And what is the topic of that conversation? Going back to the memories of the crusade and the meeting with the emperor, is the topic of nobility. So, Dante even claimed that he speaks of that in the Paradiso after the Purgatio. And the Purgatio is a technical term, is this process to which someone is re-established in his just reputation with any shame taken away. This is why we have ground to go back to the first phrase, lo coltello del mio giudizio purga in questa forma. Il coltello is the sword of the knight. Il purgare is not just purify, but it has this meaning of the purgatory, of the purgatio vulgaris, which, by the way, is a synonym for duel. The Purgatio Canonica is the other form without duel, but via pledge. There is a last little problem that an adversary of my proposal here could propose and say, well, but if Dante would speak of a duel, why speak of coltello and not of a sword, of spada? He had the words. If he speaks of coltello, here is clearly intending vendetta, etc. And for instance, we have text, we could look at the Brunetto Latini, the master of Dante, and Brunetto Latini makes a clear reference to, in the Tesoretto, he says that il coltello per fare una vengeanza, to take a revenge. So here the knife is really the knife of Compare Turiddu, for those of you who are familiar with this language. And it is nice to quote this text here, because we are, I see if I find, I had it, I hope to find it. There is a text of Lorenzo il Magnifico, and it's quite strangely, I had to prepare, I had to, if I don't find it, I have to quote by heart, which will ruin completely the beauty of this text. But yes, okay, I'm sorry for that. In one of the Nencia da Barberina, in one of those texts, he says, I am eager to throw out all your guts, to cut you and to throw these away on the roof. And you should know that I keep on my side a coltella, a knife, which allow me a lot of amusement. Well, also this text, later, we are more than 1 century later, it seems to give an idea of knife as an instrument of violence, nothing to do with the duel, etc. But here the use of the coltella is interesting, because indeed in the Italian of the origin, we have this use of these two terms. What we know today as coltello, to cut bread, meat, etc. In the Italian of the origin is usually said coltella, even though, of course, there are also uses of both. So the coltella of the Nencia is, or of Brunetto Latini, is indeed an instrument that improperly used is an instrument of which you use not. By the way, even today in Tuscany, I think that in the butchery, the coltella is the big knife that is used to cut the meat. So this is not the sword of a knife. This is really an improper tool that you can use to inflict violence. But the coltello, especially if you can reconstruct some other elements of a knightly context, it is clearly the sword. And someone who maybe knew better than us the proper meaning of those terms, Marsilio Ficino, in his Volgarizzamento of the Monarchia, when he has to translate gladium, used precisely in that passage I mentioned before, he used coltello. So he translates coltello. So the translation gladium in coltello, knife, is a further evidence of this aspect. One aspect seems, and the Israelites were 1 minute, and then, is a bit unclear. Well, okay, all this talking, just to give a little footnote on the meaning of coltello and its proposed to amendate the standard English translation, where in the Convivio you see knife, at least in 3 cases, you should put sword. It doesn't seem a spectacular contribution, and certainly would disappoint who invited me. But this is a sort of little example, a concrete example, that has the ambition to throw light on a larger issue. And why Jerusalem is involved? Because the problem of using violence among Christians was a tricky issue for the church fathers, for the medieval theologian. Well, after all, the gospel has some very explicit statement. If someone beats you, you should offer the other part of your cheek. So how you square that with the use of violence? Or the words in the Gethsemane to Peter, never take a sword in your hand because the one who has a sword will die. Well, there is a long process that starts already in the Middle Ages, in the High Middle Ages, but the turning point is the 11th century and is strictly connected with the idea of crusade. Not just the crusade to the Holy Land, which is, of course, is the sort of paradigmatic form of crusade, but all these I mentioned now are crusades, the Reconquista in Spain, the combat against the Albigenses in the south of France, the combat with the Baltic population of the Teutonic Order. So there is this movement of crusade in which the war became something that has to be justified. Not only can be justified, but under certain conditions is even meritorious. The death by combat is put on the same level of the highest form of testimony of truth, the martyrdom. So those are martyrs, those who die for the sake of truth. In this process, the crusade is a turning point. It's a complex point because it's not just a single document that established that. It's a process that takes some time. But it's very interesting to notice even in there is some literature, medieval literature, for instance, Raoul de Caen, that he described the story of Tancred. He's a French knight who really became very anxious and perplexed, because on the one side, he has been raised as a knight. He has been trained as a knight. He has pleasure in the activity of like hunting, dwelling, etc., and being ready. Those are seen as a training for being ready for the holy combat. But on the other side, the church seems to condemn all that, until he has the occasion to listen to the Pope Urban II, who called for the First Crusade. At that point, he says, Raoul de Caen, he finds again the unity of his soul. He sees no more contradiction in his life, and he put all his life at the service of the church and so on. We are not so far back. So when Dante writes, and when Dante remembers with Cacciaguida the time of the crusade, is a recent past, and is the moment in which under certain condition, ritualized use of violence embedded in a sophisticated chivalric code is considered accepted in the Christian worldview, even though remain the condemnations of a single document of theologian. And in this context, we can really see with different eyes to texts like those of the convivio, of the banquet, in which even in this little aside, there is not un movimento, like Croce said, a violent movement of someone who is losing his temper, but there is a very self-aware and precise reference to a way of settling a dispute in a definitive and clear manner. I hope that the line of the reasoning was at least possible to follow. I suppose that some points remain unclear, but if there are questions, I'm very happy to try to answer them. Thank you very much for your patience.
I'm just going to take the image. I'm sorry to take the image down. It's such a lovely image, but now we're going to open it up to the floor. So if there are questions, if people there online would like to ask any questions, please put your hand up. And also people in the room, if you would come up close to here, if you have any questions. I'll just start it off because I thought that was really fascinating, and you talked about your line of argument. It was very clear and utterly convincing. But I've always been struck by Dante and his use of courtly language. What is he actually doing here? If you take the context of a Dante, a young political Dante who grows up in the Comune, which is as far away from the Corte as you can imagine, to the post-exilic Dante who's going from town to town, and also essentially stepping back almost into history politically, and being confronted with these smaller courts and small towns. And as you go along in Dante's writings, in the Convivio, and then most especially in the Purgatorio and in the Paradiso, Dante begins to use courtly language, as we would call it, more and more in his work. And it's almost as if he's kind of it's a nostalgia for something, it's an embrace of an early ideal, but does it always remain an ideal, is I suppose my question.
Thank you very much. Well, I will, before answering, I will take an analogy with a different author, but it's then to bridge it to Boccaccio the Camelot, from Vittore Branca on, has been proposed as the literature for the new class, new commercial class of the merchants. I think that many of you have this. Until a series of scholars, I just mentioned Cherchi, Piccone, others, say, wait, certainly Boccaccio belonged to that new class. But what is expressed in the Decameron is a condemnation of wealth gained by commerce. All the merchants there appear quite negative figure. And what is the ideal defended and proposed there is the ideal of onestà, is this idea, this is a paradox, but can be applied to Dante as well. When the social reality behind a certain form of life is disappearing and fading away, doesn't mean that the intellectual form it took with all his reference, etc., precisely in this sort of nostalgia is not less, but even stronger, because there is the awareness. While this awareness is probably only inchoatively present before, while here we have, in Dante, there is also another elements that, as you know, can be traced, this constant laudatio temporis acti, this constant now the search for quick gain, exactly. But he says that in a reality that, of course, however, precisely in Florence, there are very nice chapters, still very interesting to be read today in the Storia di Firenze by Davidson, was full of tournament, of masquerade, of those exercises which constantly reenacted these sort of references.
But there is then that other side of kind of courtly culture, which is you're talking about here, and Dante says it well to another character in Canto 14 of the Purgatorio when he says "Le donne, i cavalieri, gli affanni, gli agi," and there is that other aspect of it is che invogliava amore e cortesia. So we talked about dueling as an aspect of kind of an expression of nobility. But there is the kind of more problematic aspect of courtly love. We call it now courtly love as a 19th century invention as a term. But already in Canto 5 of the Infernals, there is also a very deep criticism of that type of use of, let's call it courtly love.
Yeah, but what I would consider the most clear denunciation of that is probably Canto 5 of Inferno, where you have translation of one of the canonic texts of this kind of culture, the De Amore of Andrea Capellano. These translations are put in the mouth of Francesca da Rimini, who is clearly condemned. The romantic reading of it tried to make of her a sort of
champion of love.
Champion of love, but for Dante, she's certainly not a champion of love. She's condemned clearly. And this is a condemnation.
But is it a condemnation of, let's call it chivalric love, a courtly love, or is it a condemnation of bad imitations?
Or one possibility of that culture that wasn't able really to keep together the spiritual dimension and the earthly dimension. At the end of that canto, Dante fall down come corpo morto in cadere. And this is the idea that also for him was, he saw there a possibility that it could have been his. But he, thanks goodness, he's avoided that, thanks to the gift. So this idea, and also in the court literature at large, we have a tradition, I think of Chrétien de Troyes, where, for instance, the opposition between marriage and love is dismantled, and marriage and love are seen as compatible. Why there is in the Troubadour, etc., that was one of the great topics. Marriage is one story, and the love is another story. So I think that these different options are present there, and clearly Dante makes choices and condemned others, and is a way for him also to rewrite his own canon of that culture in his own term.
Ok, we have Gianluca, io un'osservazione, scrivo qui, non trovo tasto per alzare la mano. Okay, where do I find the rest of this message?
No, there's no rest. He wants to talk.
Oh, he wants to talk. Right, Gianluca.
Yeah. So first of all, I want to thank Professor Robiglio for this very interesting lecture that shows once again how chivalric culture could be important also to understand some aspect of Dante's works, because most of the time we tend to think that Dante's Florence is the city of trades or the city of banks, but actually the same social class that was involved in trades, in banking, especially the genti nuove, wanted to legitimize their position by imitating the traditional aristocracy. And so the chivalric values were still everywhere in Dante's time, Florence, especially in the higher classes. And also the observation on the Crusades is very interesting because my article has just been published recently by Alighieri, and I try to show how in Dante's time in Florence, there is still debate on the Crusades, because most of the time we think that after the fall of Acre in 1291, all the Crusade period is over, but actually for at least 20 years until Concilio di Vienna, there is a lot of debate on the necessity to recover the Holy Land, and this debate is clearly received by Dante and used in the Divine Comedy. So it's I've been very happy to hear this talk, because it shows once again that this aspect of medieval culture and of Dante is still alive in a period that most of the time people mostly considered as a sort of pre-modern period.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this appreciation. I will also go to look for the article, I assume in the last issue of L'Alighieri, correct? Because I'm very interested in it. This idea that there is a, sorry if I am a philosopher, so I have also to show at some point that I have a legitimate place among the philosophers. And there is this German philosopher, Ernst Bloch, who, with the word that in German is just one word, but you cannot translate with one word in English, Ungleichzeitigkeit, the non-contemporaneity. Says in a society, we should not think this society is dominated by this kind of culture, because there are always different culture present. One is dominating, but the other are there. And you could have a very rural culture today in some pockets of Germany, of North America, of Ireland, which are next door to a broker of the financial center, and the two can meet in the shop and have a chat. It's not that these two cultures cannot have communication. I think that this is important also in the case of Dante. This sort of culture of spectacles in a world where there was not television of cinema, but there was the equivalent. And this is quite, just to mention a case, in the Canto 14, this is something that was discussed with Giuseppe Ledda. In Canto 14, there is this image of the Gran Veglio, this tyrannical sort of head of a religious sect, a religious Islamic sect, who used without any major hashish. And this was a way to help them to become terrorists and assassins. There is this image. It's a bit mysterious, and this in the commentary generally said, why Dante at certain point he put this image of the, as if it had nothing to do with Florence, is a sort. Well, reading Davidson, one learns that in Florence, there was every year, a very violent, by the way, at certain point, they wanted to stop it because there were always people dead. What they call il gioco del veglio, the old man play or game, that was a sort of a feast, masquerade, in which someone dressing as this sort of head of the sect with his followers who were murderers. So he has to behave, even if it was a masquerade, they had to behave as murderers. So they try to play as murderers, and sometimes they succeeded also to kill someone. And this is something that gives another perspective on this image of the Veglio. When Dante speaks of the Veglio, he's of course in making reference to the island of Crete, etc. But his readers immediately had this resonance on these orientalistic reminiscences of far land, knights, risk and violence and murder, etc. This is an element of Florence culture, which again, if one reads the commentary on the Commedia, never find the reference. Davidson is not a remote source, even though he had the merit to delve into archives and sorting out many information.
Wonderful. Are there questions from the floor or online here before I ask another question? Elsina, will you come up so the people online can actually hear your question? Thank you very much. Just speak loudly.
So thank you very much for your interesting talk. I was wondering about this plurality of cultures that you were talking about, and how do you consider the relationship between them, like how they integrate in Dante? And you talked about a scale of priorities, and how would you explain a little bit more about this? Thank you.
This is a very important question, and I do not have any answer because it is a research in progress. I have some hypotheses, tentative ideas, but there are, I think that it's important to proceed cautiously on single research on precise topic, historical semantic, use of terminology, episodes, historical, because otherwise one risks to make claim that may have their part of truth, but then they do not resist the test of further readings, etc. We have also the problem of l'oceano smisurato, set contini, no, il pelago smisurato, set contini of the secondary literature. If someone only limited to what is published in English wanted to read what in 1 year is published on Dante, doing nothing else, and having someone taking care of her, of him, preparing food, washing everything, being also talented, not needing many hours of sleep, etc., being very healthy, and well, he wouldn't technically have the time to read everything. This is you can make. So in such a context, and also a context that is accelerated by new digital tools of artificial intelligence, etc., that in a couple of years they will further change the landscape. I think that one has to try to do things to contribute and without exceeding ambition, but also without avoiding those questions, because these give the frame for the other more little questions. So I cannot answer you, but at least give some direction. So the general point that I think can be argued is that this multiplicity of culture exists, but is not undiscriminated. We shouldn't, in a sort of effort to be inclusive, to say that for Dante everything was the same, there was all these different, and like B, he pick up something there, something there, something there. There was a sort of stratification, and so there was a sort of, like in the language, he explained that in the convivio. You have your mother tongue, the vernacular. Then you learn Latin. And thanks to Latin, which is an artificial language for him, you can learn discipline that you couldn't have learned in your mother tongue. However, you arrive there via your mother tongue. If you do not have a mother tongue, nobody can teach you in your mother tongue Latin, which is this artificial language. So there is a clear hierarchy, not to say that one is best than the other, depends the perspective. Dante himself, in one place, he says that one is more noble, or it depends how do you see that. But there is an order. I think it's the same with the cultures of Dante. First of all, we have to avoid Dante-centrism. This is a bit of temptation, because if someone I take the example of North America because I have some experience there. I do not have any experience concerning the system in literature, faculty literature here. Or if you do a thesis on Francesco da Barberino and you do a thesis on Dante, a PhD thesis, well, on the job market, one of the two has a clear advantage on the other, it seems to me. But this creates that we have plenty of works on Dante and very little works on a lot of these authors who were around it. I'm not saying, well, give away Dante. No, it's good to take Dante there, but to use like a sort of showroom also for more detailed researches, which have been conducted at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, especially in Germany and Italy, but then has been abandoned on the the detailed context. Some of them are now rediscovered and meritoriously so, but there is a lot of work to be done. And I would think that this is something that can help. So I couldn't answer to your question, but I would say, let's keep that question as a frame for other specific research questions, because it seems to me very important to have the awareness that there is a plurality, but there is a plurality with a design. Each a design not given by any of the author, but is given there. And the author, we see also ourselves, we can be very curious, but our curiosity is always guided by the kind of book we have read before, the kind of education we have read before, the kind of language we know, etc., etc. And it's the same for those authors. So it's an attempt to say what I said in the first reaction. It's a very important question. This is not an answer, but it is maybe your question a way that if it is kept alive and present can help to avoid certain one-sidedness that I constantly see today in the literature on Dante. I constantly see that. I think that could be avoided.
We have a question from Simone Marchesi. Simone, are you still there? Ecco.
I am. Thank you. Ciao, Andrea. Okay, question with it's a sort of semantics question. I am the person who is still a little bit skeptical about coltello, as the weapon of choice, so to speak, for a duellum. I really appreciate, I really love, actually, your setup of duellum as a sort of a mutual sign of respect between the contending parts. I believe that Dante is in the Convivio also thinking about that when he frames an altrui, someone who can actually, object something. And I think that, this is a long way of application. I think it gets down to the bachiller che s'arma, so the getting ready to fight in a philosophical disputation. Having said that, I really like what you did. Coltello is such a vernacular word. It's such a vernacular term. It's a diminutive. It's a culter. It's not ferrum. It's not ensis. It's not sort of a dueling, classical / chivalric sort of term. It's very vernacular. After all, coltello is the image that Dante uses to talk about the vernacular that brought together his parents. So, I mean, it's such a vernacular word, such an Italian, Florentine word, better than Italian, I rephrase myself, that I still have a little bit of hesitation to go for the full purchase of your argument. Can you convince me more? I'm happy going past, French and going old French when I am totally dilettante, and I know you are better equipped than I am.
No, I don't think I'm better equipped because you know the sources perfectly, and you master them better than I do. Well, the first element, which is a bit far-fetched, but I would put, let's say, a first note would be Ficino's volgarizzamento. There we have gladium, which is a technical word in the monarchia to refer to the sword, the short sword, because there was also the longest one, but the short sword of that was used in this single combat. And thus he uses coltello. We are at the end of the 14th century, but we are still in Florence, etc. The second element, even though I admit that there is not a total stability, is the distinction that is attested in the, I'm using the Tesoro della Lingua Italiana delle Origini, between coltello and coltella, where coltella seems really to be an improper use of something that could have different forms. Even D'Annunzio much later will make reference to Campaldino. He will speak of la coltella degli aretini, but these are not the knights, but are the pietons, the fanti, that are using this big knife to cut the horses underneath, and yes, and so to make the knight fall. So this is a sort of stratagem, not very chivalric, which coltella in this sense. Why coltello is, and very often coltella is used for what has to do with the table, with preparing the meat, etc. And it seems that at least in some occurrences still today, it is possible to say coltella as a sort of big knife, but nothing to do. This is the second. And the third element comes from Davidson, but these three notes are not enough to convince anybody. We have, the only way I can do is just with a good padrino to have a duel with you and to establish this by duel. But it is what I find in Davidson, I think is in the Storia di Firenze, is where he speaks of, I think it was book 4, I don't remember where, of the army, mercenaries, etc., etc. And he says of this custom of those, there is a moment in Florence where everybody became knights very easily. Even the popolo gave these before they needed people on the horse. So before a battle, they say, you 100 people, you are not. So there are these things. And the three elements that distinguish one of those knights are having an horse, having this little sword, which is even not the main weapon during any combat, but is a sort of a piece of, let's say, of the habit, of the dress code of the knight. And then to have an oak. Again, you don't bring the oak, il falcone, on the battlefield, but you have an oak at home. You go hunting with it, and this distinguish a knight. A knight can be very poor, but not too poor, because he has to be able to maintain a horse, to have this minimal dress code, and to have an oak. Only exceptionally, and now we have a case very nice in Boccaccio, someone who can sacrifice the oak, the falco, but for very noble and gentle purposes only. So this third aspect, again, indicates a sword which is very short, is a symbol rather than an actual. But I didn't want to claim that if there were a duel, Dante would use this coltello. But is saying this is a question that has to be settled by a duel, and is making reference to one of the, let's say, objective correlate of the knight.
However, in the duel that you're going to have with Simone, you can have the coltello and he can have the sword. Okay, I just wanted to return very briefly to this whole idea of the fixer-pes, or this idea, this implied interlocutor, whoever says this and whoever says that. Are there times that, however, I know it is a rhetorical trope, but are there times where we know the identity of what they're talking about? Because I always think of that there's a wonderful moment in Canto 20 of the Inferno when Virgil says, però t'assenno che se tu mai odi altrimenti la mia terra originale. So he's talking about, if you ever hear about the origin of my city in any different way, do not let la verità nulla menzogna frodi. Don't, do not let this lie stand. And yet the only other place when we hear about the origin of Islam is in Virgil himself. So Virgil is kind of identifying himself as someone who's saying the opposite of what he's saying here. So I suppose my question is, in the examples that you were talking about, can we identify this other, or is it always just left there as a rhetorical trope?
There was a research by which the one who gave me the idea to focus on this was the late Thomas Ricklin, who wanted really to do an exhaustive research on these through the different works of Dante, also through other authors, etc. It's, for instance, it seems that in some cases, this fictio is used for a sort of appello al lettore, in some cases. In the comedy, we have already the distinction, very obvious, between Dante as an author and Dante as a character, and these already allow this. It's very interesting, your question. I don't think that is impossible to. I don't think that there is always one historical or real face behind this fiction, but it's a sort of fiction which is able to stand for different person. And I also think that is a fiction that has a given plurality. So there is the sort of the alter ego, who is can be an opponent, but in a just for this someone who helps you to think. Is a sort of elderly brother, or like a virgin that helps you to develop that. Then there is a figure who is more hostile, but still at the end it comes to the. And then you have this case of the adversary, who is really someone who is against you, and you have really to combat, to convince him, because he's constantly arguing. And in the case of the Convivio, of course, he has said at the beginning of the book 4, this is written against those who contra gli erranti. This is those who are mates, who are erring, who are wrong. And those there may be those references at the beginning of the book, and those references during the book should be connected in a way, because the entire book is commenting a canzone contra gli erranti. I would assume, as an hypothesis, that all these fictiones personarum are masks of maybe not one errante, but of different of those people who all together are the target of book 4. But I think that in other cases, you shouldn't apply this scheme, can be different.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yes.
I think Andrea has deserved his dinner tonight. We will be careful with the coltello there. But just before we go this evening, I just want to say that next week's lecture, again, in the same place and same venue and online, is going to be, we're lucky to have Professor Martin McLaughlin, who's going to be talking to us about Dante and antiquity. So please join us next week at the same time. But before we go, could you please join me in thanking once again Andrea for a quite wonderful lecture. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't find the text for